Welcome back to another Boxscore Geeks show. I'm your host, Dre Alvarez, and with me is the original NBA geek, Patrick Minton, who you can find on Twitter as NBA Geek. Give a quick
Not to be
shout out,
confused
Patrick.
with all those, fake NBA geeks that have popped up since then.
Yeah, we might talk that a little. We are produced, as always, by the voice of God, Brian Foster, who you can find on Twitter as Boxscore Brian. Brian has opted not to be on camera this week. I guess he's getting a little gun shy, but Brian, give a shout out just so our audio listeners know what your voice sounds like.
What's up, Dre? What's up, Patrick? A lot of good stuff on the show tonight.
And on the off chance that you found this podcast not directly through the site, we are at boxscoregeeks.com. All right, so we're just going to get right into the show. We're going to be talking a little bit about Sloan, not too much, but we weren't there, so we'd be remiss if we didn't at least say something about it. We're going to be largely talking about stockpiling assets, namely the Sam Hinkie and Philadelphia 76ers plan. And then, of course, we're going to have to talk a little bit about Derrick Rose. Patrick, I think you jinxed him. And then finally, as always, we get some shout outs on the show, so wait for those. All right, so last week on the show, we were lucky enough to have Paul Shirley, and we basically bounced back and forth. And what ended up being the poll for the show was this idea of, was there an arms race in statistics among teams? And namely, was the arms race over? This was like a comment Mark Cuban made right before Sloan. The poll basically came out 2-1 against. We may have biased that a little, Patrick, because I think we said, no, we think that's absurd on the show. And then our listeners seem to follow the same thing. I find it interesting because Sloan happened this week. Neither of us could attend, just life gets in the way. I watched a little of it online. A criticism I'll give, and this is unfortunate given us, we definitely feel the pain of having a live show and audio video issues. My internet's cut out before, our microphones have cut out. It's embarrassing. At Sloan, they actually had a broken camera, but they were charging $30 a feed. So I paid $30 to get the feed, and then the camera was broken on the main ballroom, which
to me, I don't know. It's the same grief I have with NBA League Pass and how awful their broadband app is. It's just fucking terrible. And it's, the minute you start charging people money, that's inexcusable. And I guess, I don't know. And I don't know, did you ask for a refund? Because I think you should. And I think, actually, you know what? You shouldn't even have to ask. They should be coming out and saying, hey, we're sorry, all you guys. We're going to give each of you $5 back because that's crazy and unacceptable. You charged money. That's not okay. I get that you're an academic organization. You're not software developers, but you charged money. So you got to deliver. That's completely unacceptable.
Yeah, but I mean, and I started watching, and I ended up writing a piece about it called How to Write, How to Write a Mainstream Speech on Analytics. And it's, I enjoy Sloan. Basically what I'll say is Sloan is to science as a science fiction convention is to science. So let me try it again. Sloan is to analytics as a science fiction convention is to science. There are lots of cool names to see there. You can meet people from teams. You can meet cool people that you've read on the internet. It's a fun party. You can see some cool talks. You can see some cool new things coming out.
Like last year we met Sam Hinkie, for example.
Yeah, which was awesome. Well, you got to meet him and impress him. I got to not recognize him, which was great. So
as a quick aside, because we're going to talk about in a minute, Sam Hinkie had the greatest 30-second interview I've ever had with an NBA person, which is where, we said, hey, I'm a big fan of your work. And he was like, you are? Because I'm sure he's used to, everybody in Philadelphia getting sick of the losing. And then, I said, I especially love the way you guys are handling your finances and you're not wasting money on, talent that you don't need right now. And he was kind of sort of nodding his head. I mean, I was basically trying to say something clever to distinguish myself from all the other fanboys. And then at some point I said, but if there's one thing you could do for me, if you could somehow clear the way to win just 2 more games, because I've got the over on the team. And he looked at me like I was an insane man. And he's like, you've got the over on our team? He looked at me and he was like, what the hell were you thinking? They ended up winning 19 games, which is 3 more than I needed. But Still,
Yeah, that
and
was
I would say the same thing to him this year if I met him. I'd be like, you know, 3 more games, damn it, 3 more games.
and
Sorry, that
so
was a bit of a
and we'll talk
derailment there.
more on analytics and teams, and I'd feel remiss if I didn't just, I definitely on this show, if people have listened in the past and some of my writing, you may have seen a cynicism from me about this notion that things are going to catch on mainstream. You had a great talk, I think, with Hardwood Peroxium. Did I say that right? On Twitter, where basically they were like,
Roxism, I
"Love your
think.
work, but could you do you have to be so harsh on the other metrics?" And as soon as that comes out, you just kind of go, "This is never going to catch on, is it?" Like if I'm not allowed to be mean to which is a popular stat at ESPN. If you're listening to this, I'd be surprised if you didn't know that. And then right after I wrote this piece, Ben Gulker pointed me at an interview with Stan Van Gundy that basically almost seemed like it cribbed off of exactly what I said. So yeah, my cynicism about the future of sports analytics for teams is just not that great. Sloan kind of reinforced that. It's a lot of fun. I'm just not convinced that there was ever a Moneyball revolution, even in baseball. And I'm just not convinced it's going to happen in basketball. And as you said, I think when we did the back and forth, you said Paul Shirley nailed it on last week's show. As long as NBA teams are giving jobs to players that are unqualified, not that they weren't good players, that are unqualified for the jobs they have, analyzing analytics, analyzing finances, we're never going to see an advancement. And that's just kind of where we're at. And I figured I'd comment that, and I'll let you get the last word on Sloan.
I mean, it goes a little bit back to the Barkley thing, right? I mean, Charles Barkley is expressing an opinion that most people in the journalism, in the mainstream media, I'll say, thought was crazy, right? About analytics, but it's actually probably not all that different from what so many other players think. And in most organizations, there will be guys like Charles Barkley that have some kind of decision-making power. And as long as the analytics guy has to defer to that guy, things are never going to change. As long as whatever analytics I come up with have to kind of agree with that one X player's worldview, then it's not going to matter. Because I see so many guys doing really incredible things, but then the minute they're talking to an ex NBA player, they just start couching their kind of assumptions in caveats, right? It's like, you know, I think if you had to work for the New York Knicks, for example, could you ever say anything that says Melo isn't that good? Like, could you ever be in any room and say, "Well, Melo's just not very good at basketball"? You just wouldn't get anywhere. You would have to couch it all and kind of, well, Melo's really not the best defender, and kind of do all this sort of like, I don't know, conventional wisdom bullshit to get your real point across, which is, hey, I wish we'd all just spend way more fucking time looking at player efficiency and less time looking at like, points per game.
And so, by the way,
is a good
one
start.
funny note
It's a good start,
that
but
that cracked me up on what you just said about being polite and all that is I was just picturing you interviewing for an NBA team and just taking one of your many rants that you've done on these shows, these fantastic rants. Brian and me, we just sit back and let you. You're like, I don't want to rant, and when you start, Brian and I just shut up and we're like, go Patrick, go. Just having an NBA team play that for you when you're in the room and you just going, I'll see myself out.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think I've committed so many things to YouTube that it would literally be impossible for me to ever get an NBA job
I would hope
unless it was literally
job,
from somebody who was looking. If it was, like directly an owner who was like, I want to hire that guy who just disagrees with everything, just so that I have a guy in the room that disagrees with everything to sort of challenge our thought processes. That would be the only way I could ever get any kind of job like that. Not that I ever would try. I mean, I think it's kind of obvious from the way I behave.
Listening, just the one other note I'll give from Sloan that I've noticed is pay the people what they're worth. That's one of my biggest complaints in sports is these NBA teams are like, we're looking for an analytics squad. We would like to hire someone for $30,000 a year. No, go to Silicon Valley, say that, you'll get laughed at. Now, on that note, let's actually talk about a team that's being, on the one hand, you might call them cheap. On the other hand, you might call them fiscally conservative. We got into kind of a discussion about I called it the best way to win a title and then the best way to get a big three. And by the way, this is an example in arguments. This was on the Idea channel. It's one of my favorites. It's called the moving goalpost fallacy. And basically, it's if you get in an argument with someone, they just keep changing the criteria over and over and over again, so it's impossible for you to ever win. All I was doing with the first piece, which I was talking about, how do the teams that win titles acquire their best player, is I said, The conventional wisdom that I keep hearing on Twitter over and over and over again is the best way to find a star is in the draft. And I said, how many NBA teams that have won a title found their star in the draft? And the answer is it is the biggest single group, but these other groups, trades, free agency, etc., dwarf it. And as a result, that's incorrect conventional wisdom. And people said, well, what about big threes? And I did that. And after big threes, people said big twos. So basically, all I'm saying is the conventional wisdom everybody has, it's really hard to get a star. The best way to get one in the draft is just not true in the history of the NBA. I'd actually be curious on some of your comments there before we move on to some of the other parts of this discussion.
I mean, so there's a couple things here. One is that's not apparently true, and the other is that obviously there's more than one way to get. Even if you did buy that, there's more than one way to stockpile draft picks, right? You don't necessarily have to lose to stockpile draft picks. I mean, okay, let's take, for example, a trade made by Sam Hinkie where he traded away Jrue Holiday for essentially 2 first-round picks. One was a known first-round pick in Nerlens Noel, and the other was an unknown first-round pick in the future. But it was essentially just trading one established player away for 2 first-round picks. Now, you may say that, well, Philadelphia did that because they were tanking or whatever. But the point is, they sold high on Jrue Holiday. He's a player that you and I have always agreed on is a decent but not great player. I think trading him for 1 first-round pick would be a reasonable trade, but for 2, that's insanity. He's just, and this is not because I think that first-round picks are worth the sky and the moon, but I'm just talking about the market value of first-round picks and what you can get for a first-round pick. You can get a decent rotation player. 2 first-round picks, as the Kevin Love trade has evidenced, essentially gets you a star, right? Because I'm not going to count Anthony Bennett. He was literally just thrown into that trade for salary purposes because Cleveland was like, you get 2 first-round picks and then fuck you. You can have Anthony Bennett or nothing. Cleveland wasn't going to give away anything else. So 2 first-round picks get you a star, and 1 first-round pick gets you a rotation player. And Jrue Holiday, at least at the time of the trade, was not a star. He's been playing a little better since then, but he's still,
By the way, checking in on Nerlens Noel, who we were hoping about, he went 7 for 7 tonight with 7 rebounds, 2 steals, and a block.
He was actually part of an article that I did not publish. Last Friday, you had an idea for an article, so you published it quickly. Well, I was writing up a little, hey, quick Friday tidbits, because Friday's kind of the day where we kind of don't really try that hard because traffic's low anyway. Anyway, one of the points I was making is that, hey, I don't know if anyone's paying attention, but Nerlens Noel is really good right now. If you look at his splits since the 1st of November, 1st of January, since the 1st of January, he's averaging about 6 points over par per 48, and he's it's largely on the strength of an extremely high block rate. It's like four blocks per 48 minutes, average kind of rebounding numbers, improved field goal efficiency, low turnovers, high steals. Basically, he's turning into exactly kind of sort of the defensive stalwart that people kind of hoped he could become. And I don't know, if you were in some kind of win score league or wins produced league or something like that with your friends, grab this guy now for $5 before people start noticing, because he's really, really good since the beginning of the year. And he's one of the reasons
By the way, he's got a nice 5-game streak going, but the team that did slow him down? Milwaukee Bucks. Go team, go.
Yeah, he's one of the reasons I'm kind of optimistic that the 76ers will manage to eke out 3 more wins before the season's over.
All right. So, and by the way, on this kind of main thing, because I'm going to kind of try and move us towards the 76ers are currently this extreme plan that I think one thing we've kind of accepted in the group is, while the idea of tanking to get draft picks and stockpiling draft picks is certainly something common in the NBA, no team has quite done it this way, where they basically, the one thing that tends to happen is teams will get rid of salary cap and then waste the salary cap, or they'll get draft picks at the cost of getting bad contracts. The 76ers seem to have an edict that says no bad contracts, which we're a fan of. And the only issue we're kind of having is this is kind of like a horse in a race that everybody tells you breaks late. And we're going, well, you're halfway through the race, horse. You don't have to break, but maybe pick up the speed a little bit. But moving on to that, one of the things that I kind of talked about when it came to stockpiling draft picks, and this is maybe the other side of the 76ers, is we looked at 2 examples, Kobe Bryant and Kawhi Leonard. Kawhi Leonard. I always get that last name wrong. And basically the point being, yeah, you don't need to own the draft pick to draft that player. You can trade for that draft pick. And what we notice in both those cases is, unlike, say, the Oklahoma City Thunder, who just can't catch a break this season, and maybe it's a curse for trading away James Harden, they traded James Harden like a year earlier than they needed to. Whereas, the Los Angeles Lakers said, we have Vladivac. I'm just messing up. Thank you. I'm just messing up pronunciations all over the place. Apologies to NBA players that watch this podcast. But they said, let's wait until draft day and trade him then. We don't need to trade him a year with 2 years left on his contract or whatever. We can wait till the player is picked to trade him, and the same with the Spurs. They said, we don't need to trade George Hill for a draft pick that we can use. We can wait until draft day, talk to a team that has a pick in the range we want, and trade Jordan Hill. We have assets.
And if you look at the history of him, like they originally talked to, was it Milwaukee or whoever the team with Utah, maybe the team with like the 11 or the 12 pick. They had originally talked to them to try to get Kawhi Leonard, and it didn't work. And they were worried that Leonard wouldn't be on the board when the next team that they could find that was interested was up, which was Indiana. I mean, it was clear that Kawhi Leonard was an acquisition, not a draft pick. They wanted to draft Kawhi Leonard. They weren't going to just draft anybody. They didn't just want a random, 15 pick.
And something to that's also kind of important is, here's something. I'm trying to remember the 3 years in a row. I think it was Andrea Bargnani, followed by Dwight Howard, followed by LeBron James, or maybe I might be switching one of those two. I think those 3 drafts happened in succession, if I recall. I'm going to try and cheat and look that up. But the thing being, all drafts are not created equal. And that's one of the rough parts about stockpiling draft picks is you're kind of at the mercy of, Andrew Wiggins deciding, screw you, I'm going to go back to school. And it went LeBron James, then Dwight Howard. Sorry. And actually, it was Andrew Bogut and then Bargnani. I got my stats completely wrong. But yeah, you're at the mercy of the draft behaving the way you want it to behave. Yeah. Whereas if you wait till the day of the draft and just look for people that want picks, you're probably not going to get Blake Griffin or John Wall. In the case of John Wall, you don't want John Wall, but you can wait till that draft and get a player you want as long as you're not targeting the top player.
Yeah. Well, even if you're targeting a top player, if you give up enough for him, you get him. As the example this year being Minnesota gave up Kevin Love to get Andrew Wiggins.
Yeah, though, I mean, that's interesting because the question is, was it Minnesota targeting Andrew Wiggins or was it Cleveland targeting Love? But yeah, you're
well, but I mean, the point is that, there were a lot of potential trades out there for Kevin Love, but Flip Saunders, for better or worse, and I'm saying the jury's still out on it, no matter what people are saying, he said, all I want is Andrew Wiggins. Nothing less is going to really let go of Kevin Love. And that's a position that almost any team could be in, right? Like there were probably a lot of trades that Oklahoma City could have done with James Harden, and they took the one with the most draft picks, even though, as you and I have discussed many times, the proper solution would have been to either A, give him the max contract he wants, or B, let him play out the year and then let restricted free agency play its role, right?
It is so weird to me. And I mean, the question we can get into here is actually the same with the 76ers. So I feel we've talked that. Do you have anything else you want to add? Like I said, I had those 2 pieces. We've talked a little bit about drafting. I think, Brian, you might have had one more point, so go ahead and type it to me or jump in if you have it. But then something else happened. We ended up in a discussion basically on the Wages of Wins forum with Ari Caroline, Arturo Galletti, Dave Barry. Dave Barry, who wrote the idea of, if you're a GM and you go 3 years without making the playoffs, you should be fired. That's what Dave, the owner, would do. Is a little more dour about Hinkie, because according to that metric, Hinkie's got 1 more year to make the playoffs. He's not making it this year. So, in Dave's world, if Hinkie didn't make the playoffs next year, he'd be axed. But we kind of got into discussion back and forth. And so I'm curious to you. So we're going to revisit this, as you mentioned from your anecdote. You approached Hinkie, said, good job, good job. What are your thoughts on what he's done this year and going forward? How are you feeling about the team?
So I think we've had this argument almost to death internally, but and a little bit it's eked out in your articles that you've written. But I think that the Philadelphia Sixers are doing a good job in terms of the strategy that they've laid out. That they are being very internally consistent, and they're doing it, I guess, the right way. The question you and I have is whether or not that strategy needed to even be followed in the first place. For example, if you look at like a league in a league full of guys that we think are undervalued, it would not have been hard for Philadelphia to, without even giving away draft picks, for Philadelphia to just sign a few players at the $4 to $5 million level, still be way under the draft cap, and have a team that's winning 30 to 40 wins. And that's without even sacrificing any draft picks.
I'm amazed that Milwaukee managed to do this, but yeah, like Milwaukee managed to pick up Jared Dudley for nothing. Now it gets weird with injury and stuff. He had an off year, and they know stuff we. I hate using that phrase, by the way. They know stuff we don't. The one place I will give it to teams.
No. Jared Dudley is very simple. He had one bad year, and Doc Rivers and company decided, oh, that must mean he's done, rather than looking at his entire career and thinking, well, he's obviously going to bounce back. Everybody else said, well, yeah, Jared Dudley's going to bounce back, including the team that wanted him in Milwaukee, and that's the end of story. There's no hidden fucking genius here. I mean,
well,
it's idiotic to think
I will give some credence, and we've talked, for instance, the Mavericks here. I will give some credence to injury news because I don't know, like they may have an x-ray of this guy's knee and it could very well look like there's nothing there. There's no cartilage, and they go, it is impossible this player is going to play. And we've seen players defy the odds. Like there's a
but his performance was not injury related, was it?
I think Dudley was injured his year on the Clippers. I believe that's actually what I've heard since.
Okay. Well, so that makes the Clippers even more foolish, because now that he's healthy, you would expect him to, even if not right away, you would expect him to bounce back to his pre-injury levels at some point, because he's not 40 years old, right? I mean, he's not old enough to think, well, okay, he's done. To me, the fact that the Clippers gave up on Dudley is the perfect example of how, Doc Rivers, he might be a decent coach, but he's a terrible GM.
Yeah, and I mean, it's the one thing I'll give you is cost, because, for instance, when we look at players like Carmelo Anthony, where I made the comment, and I've gotten knocked back a little bit since if you look at his performance, New York, every time they've paid him, he basically lived up to the performance you would expect. Like, you can't look at Melo's performance and be mad at Melo, because he basically, until this year where he got injured, lived up to it. Now, the problem you can look at with Melo is, as you just said, age, and you go, well, Melo's entering his 30s. He's starting to get a little banged up. Maybe offering him 5 years at the max isn't the right maneuver. But I agree with what you're saying, which is, if you're going to take a $2 million risk on a player, and we're going to talk a little bit more about risking on injured players in the next segment, about 5 minutes. But yeah, like, I don't think Jared Dudley with his price point was a bad idea. And so we've got that. I guess the question being, I hate to speak ill, because, Arturo basically quoted me a few times, quoted Ari a few times in that article. A comment he made, and I do want to smack this down, maybe I'm just being mean, is he said Kobayashi made a paradigm-changing shift in eating hot dogs. That's from Super Freakonomics, or Think Like a Freak is the book. Think Like a Freak. Great book. Pick it up if you haven't. They talk about people who completely changed the paradigm, completely changed the model, and blew away the previous record. The problem I have in the NBA, and we even talked about this, the Lakers and Celtics, for example, is Hinkie's not blowing away a previous paradigm. There have been teams that have been able to quickly get themselves back up to 50-plus wins and win for seasons and seasons. I just don't see this as paradigm changing, and I guess that's the only real question we have is, how much more time, I guess, in your mind, do we give Hinkie before, I don't want to say close the door, but before we say maybe this strategy was a little more out there than it needed to be?
Okay, for me, 1 year.
Yeah, for you.
And that 1 year is next year. I want to see how good Joel Embiid is. And because if Joel Embiid lived up to, kind of the levels we think he's capable of, they are a team that has two great big men. And that's the point where you're ready to flip the switch. If you have two great big men, you flip the switch and you just try to win, because you have like 6-7 years where you get to keep these guys no matter what. Like, you have their rookie contract, and then they become restricted free agents, and you can match any offer. So you now have your two big men, which should be your goal in any all the time when you're trying to build a dynasty. Okay, now I've got my two big men. What do I surround them with? So maybe, like, what I'm looking at is next year, around January, how good is Joel Embiid? And if he's really good, are they trying to surround him with winners, or are they still doing let's just see where we land in the lottery next year? Because that's 4 wasted months. If in January it looks like they're good, then pay $10 million for two competent free agents, make a trade. It's really not that hard to get like average level NBA talent. You surround two dominant big men by a bunch of average level NBA talent, and you have a 40-win team, which in the East is easily an 8-7 seed, and then you just get better from there. That's pretty simple. That's how I would do it. Now, I don't know if that's how Sam Hinkie thinks it works and what Hickey's going to do, but that's what I would do. That's what I would do. And then you're looking at Dario Saric joining him the year after that, and you're looking at two dominant big men getting better, and you start having the type of environment where free agents want to come and play for you because you're actually in a big market. Philadelphia's a pretty big market. You're on the East Coast, you're close to New York. There's a lot of reasons that if they were a big winning team, free agents might want to come to Philadelphia.
And
so
for the
for
record,
me, it's next year.
Okay, so actually that's fantastic, and we're nearing the end of the segment, so that's perfect timing. But I will say, like, the other thing, and this is one of the an Arturo point that he has made that I heartily agree with, is the landscape for the CBA is about to change, and every team is going to get the benefit of having extra cap space. That's just going to happen. So if the 76ers start with a head start, like you're saying, if Noel, who is playing rather well, and he played rather well tonight, and I'm less optimistic on Embiid, but maybe one other player. If they find one other player in the draft.
Why are you less optimistic in Embiid?
Wasn't he like a really, like? Did you look up like his weight thing? He like showed up like super out of shape.
Yeah, it's been totally exaggerated. I've seen YouTube clips of him playing like a week ago.
Okay.
Like
so
shooting around and warm ups, and he might be 10 or 20 pounds heavier than what he was at the beginning of the season. But A, it doesn't look like much like fat, and B, it's totally within range of what you could expect for somebody who's essentially not been able to play and is only rehabbing. He totally looks.
Man, this
he looks like an athletic big man to me. When I don't know, you could like Google it yourself and look at YouTube clips. He doesn't look fat to me. He looks like a chunky adult big man.
I don't know how you feel about this, Patrick, but we could turn this week's poll into a very stereotypical Cosmo poll of, do you think Joel Embiid looks overweight? I think I'm going to have to do that at this point.
Well, if our readers are anywhere nearly as harsh as like the average Cosmo reader, then obviously everyone's going to think he's overweight. But he looks pretty muscular and athletic to me. Like,
by the way, it's always hit and miss how much people who listen to the podcast interact when I like throw questions out in the middle of the air. But another one would be a hilarious, like, who wore it better? So like two players on the same team with the same number, because you can get a similar image of both. Anyway, I'm getting us way off track, and we're right at the end of that. I'm going to say I don't see Hinkie's move as being groundbreaking, game-changing. I question if maybe he wasted a year, but that's not a big deal. They're in a big market, right? They're the only team in Philadelphia. They're not wasting money, which are behind. They're stockpiling assets. I'm on your side, which is basically next year, what they do next year. And if it's not a push in the direction to being a competitive team, then I'm going to say you overthought this. You got too clever.
And it's actually, I really want to bring this in because it's interesting that you brought up the whole idea of paradigm shifting and Kobayashi, because our fellow wages wins contributor, Jeremy Britton, he brought up a really interesting thing about how the whole idea of I believe it's human powered flight.
It was like for gliders. Yeah.
For gliders. So the way this used to work is you would sit in a lab and you would basically build an airplane, and it would take you like 2 to 3 years to build an airplane. And then you would go out onto an open field somewhere and you would try your glider out, and it would crash. And then you'd be like, fuck, what do we do wrong? We go back to the lab and you'd spend another 3 years building an airplane. And this guy came along, and I'm forgetting his name right now. I think it might have even be Chris Wright, which sounds kind of crazy.
No, that would be awesome.
But he basically looked and he said, the way we're doing this is we're solving the problem wrong, because the real problem here isn't how do I build a human powered glider. The problem is, how do I build a human powered glider in a couple of months so that I can test it out? So he recognized that what it's really a problem is, it's a problem of how fast can you build a glider so that when you inevitably have to start over from scratch, you don't spend 3 years to get back to test your next data point, because he knew that he needed to go through many, many data points before he would get it right. And that's exactly what he did. He just redesigned the entire process of building a human powered glider and said, I want to be able to build a human powered glider in a matter of months so that I can get 3 data points a year instead of 1 data point every 3 to 4 years. And he basically reinvented the way human powered gliders are built, and that was a huge paradigm shift. And what I'm suggesting is that there's no paradigm shift happening here with Hinkie, because Hinkie's doing an experiment where it's going to take him 3 years to get his first data point. And the experiment that I'd like to see done is, how about an NBA manager goes out there and says, can I build a championship team on $30 million or less? Because our central tenet, our central premise all along has been that there are tons of undervalued contracts in the NBA because the decision makers don't understand what produces wins. They overvalue things like points per game. They might even overvalue things like rebounds per game. They might overvalue per game because they don't look at per minute production. And so you could build a team. Here's my suggestion, and I'm limiting myself to guys who are not on rookie contracts so that we don't fall into the trap of, well, that's just cheap because of the draft. Why wouldn't we take a team and build it like, okay, let's get Kyle Lowry to play point guard because he's making like $7 million a year. Let's get like Ed Davis to play a power forward because he's making almost nothing.
Oh, Ed Davis's contract is a joke. I don't know.
Let's get a guy like, Chris Anderson at center because he makes almost nothing because he's pretty old. Maybe we can find another center who is similarly undervalued. I'm riffing off the top of my head now, so it's really hard for me to do this, right? Let's get Kyle Korver. He only costs like $7 million a year. Let's get at shooting guard. Let's get a guy like Thabo Sefolosha, or there's other guys. I'm trying to list the guys that I actually listed out in our group, and field a team like that, and everybody who believes that. Here, let me find the list I have right here. Okay, here's the team: Kyle Lowry, Kyle Korver, Al-Farouq Aminu, Ed Davis, and Brandon Wright. This is my $30 million starting five. Well, and off the bench, I'll find somebody else who's really undervalued.
So, by the way,
not on a rookie contract.
One thing you can do, Patrick, with that also, this is kind of paradigm shifting, and also Mark Cuban kind of did this, but not the way I would, which is in the NBA, if you want to do a trade, the rules basically say unless one of the teams is vastly under the cap, you have to trade for equal value in terms of salaries. And the rules also say you have to be roughly 80% of the cap. Now, that makes something valuable, which is if I have a $10 million contract near trade deadline time, the other team only has to pay like $1 to $2 million for the remainder of the year because I've paid most of the contract.
Right.
I can trade that player and give that team flexibility, and they might give me something. And if I've got draft picks or whatever, like this is what we've actually noticed in the history of the NBA is that there aren't that many trade deadline like trades that are really important because most teams don't want to give up good assets for reasons like that. So to what you're saying, if you have a core 30 million you're spending on a winning team, and then you say, well, I have to, according to the rules, spend that other 20 million, you can have a rotation of like 1-year contracts of players who are willing to just take that money because you're paying them more than they would get per year.
Or you could just spend the rest of your 30 million on rookie contracts, right?
Exactly.
I mean, so here's the thing. These 5 players, none of them superstars by any conventional measure, but our statistics posit a team like this would win like 60 games. And there would be a bunch of people that would say, you're crazy, this team would win 25 games. And here's the thing, you can all like outside, the outside world's going to come at us and they're going to say, well, yeah, sure, Al-Farouq Aminu looks great on a per minute basis, but you play him 40 minutes a game, he won't look that good. And you play him with a roster like this, all these interaction effects are going to happen. He's not going to get good shots because he's not playing with good players, blah, 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 blah. Well, why don't you test that fucking theory out? It's going to cost you 1 year, and it's going to cost you $30 million. It's like half the salary cap. And in a year, you're going to know which of us is right.
By the way,
or you could try this strategy where you try your shit and see if it works in the draft, and 4 years later, you're going to get one goddamn data point. It's really easy. Just put the money on the line and test it out. It costs you nothing. If it doesn't work out, if these players are all as bad as people say they are, then, well, it looks like you're still tanking. So why not give it a try? What's the worst that can happen? You win 25 games and then you're right. And then you end up exactly where you wanted to be in the beginning, which is tanking. And the best case scenario, we turn out right. You've won 60 plus games and you figured out a way to beat the market. It just seems like a no-brainer for somebody to try this.
Two things, Patrick, there. One, you're kind of a jerk because I may have to just transcribe that and make it its own post. That was awesome. Two, the Detroit Pistons kind of fell into this by accident. If you recall, they ended up with Ben Wallace because they lost Grant Hill. And the way the NBA works is when you lose a superstar to free agency, back in the days of sign and trades, the other team would basically go, I'm taking your star, so I'm going to give you a draft pick as consolation. I'm going to give you a rotation player as consolation.
Yeah, the most recent CBA pretty much put the kibosh on sign and trades.
But back in the day, that used to be the case. I would target your free agent to make sure there were no hard feelings. I would give you a draft pick or two when I took your free agent. And then they picked up Chauncey Billups, who, as you pointed out, was playing okay in Minnesota, but basically took off in Detroit. Mm-hmm. And then they had drafted Tayshaun Prince, who wasn't I think he was a lottery pick, but I don't think he was fantastic. So they lucked into these productive players just out of happenstance. It wasn't a choice. It was like, our team's falling apart. Well, it's falling apart. Let's patch together a team. And that was one of the best teams ever. And then what happens when Joe Dumars is up to build a team again? He goes back to conventional wisdom. It's like, it's funny that no one learned from that. And I don't
it seems to have learned from the mistakes that Isaiah Thomas made or any New York Knicks team since 2000, basically.
And so actually, I don't have a clever segue. We went a little over on that, but I'm okay because that was such an awesome, like I said, that's a post on its own that may or may not turn into a post if I get the time. But something else, as I said, you put the jinx on this for two reasons. You said Derrick Rose is actually helping your bet on Chicago because I think you took the under. Am I mistaken?
He was helping when he was playing.
Exactly. So you basically said you bet the under on Chicago. It's going to be close. And the fact of the matter is Derrick Rose playing this year helps. And in fact, friend of the show, Paul Shirley, actually, I believe it's for El País is how you say it, wrote a piece where he quoted wins produced this year and basically said exactly what you're saying, which is Derrick Rose this year. And I'm just going to let you go because I don't want to, we talked pre-show and I don't want to steal all of your material. So I'm going to let you, and also Paul Shirley echoes this in his piece, talk about Derrick Rose and this season for the Bulls.
Yeah, what's interesting is when he got hurt, everywhere was saying, oh, right before the All-Star break, he was playing his best basketball of the year. And I looked at the splits and I'm like, you're all fucking high. He's terrible. He's been terrible all year. He may have had one good game before the All-Star break, but there was no trend at all upwards in terms of his playing. If you look at his split since the 1st of January, his points over par per 48 was like -5, and since the 1st of February it was like -6. He's just not playing well at all. He's shooting threes at career high rates, and I mean like way over like the next year, while shooting 30% from beyond the arc. His assists are at like all-time lows. His turnovers are at all-time highs. He's just not a good player. I mean, and let me separate this from discussions we used to have, where we used to have discussions where we would say, well, Derrick Rose as an MVP wasn't really a worthy MVP. There were better players. He was kind of overrated, which I will still stand by. But the point was that version of Derrick Rose was a very good player. Even if we were saying he's overrated, he was definitely a star player. This version of Derrick Rose is not that player. If you look at what he's doing on the court now and what he did then, they are not the same player at all. There's no comparison. It's not 2010 anymore. You guys all need to catch up. Things have happened, and this isn't the same Derrick Rose. I'm sorry, Bulls fans, but this guy is not a good NBA player, and he was killing them. He was shooting them out of games. So, and I'm not saying that Henrich or Aaron Brooks are superstars, but they're going to be better than Derrick Rose was, because Derrick Rose was a shadow of a former NBA player out there on the court. So he was helping my bet a lot. And now, he's injured, so that kind of hurt.
By the way, one other thing that did happen though, and this is Hannibal Buress is one of the most hilarious stand-up comics. I just got into a bunch of his stuff these last couple of weeks. He's the next Mitch Hedberg is how I'd view him. And he was actually talking about the problem about being a sports fan if you're a gambler. And he basically said, like if he was interviewing people after games, he'd be like, so how did you feel about blowing the spread for all the people at the end of the game there? And so the funny thing is, this is going to make me feel just as bad because I'm saying kind of the same thing. Jimmy Butler is injured for 3 to 6 weeks. So.
Yeah, that's going to be the big thing. That's going to totally kill them. And it's one of those things that, I think Dave mentioned this on Twitter. Like, Chicago's probably going to lose a bunch of games now, and everybody's going to say it was because Derrick Rose is out. And Jimmy Butler somewhere's got to be thinking, fuck me. How much Does Jimmy Butler have to carry this team like he's been doing for 2.5 years before people start to realize that it's not fucking Derrick Rose that is the Bulls' problem? It's all their other injuries that are the problem. And with Butler out for 3 to 6 weeks, I feel very confident that I'm going to hit that under, despite how well Chicago did at the beginning of the season.
Another thing is, I looked at the numbers for Derrick Rose, and during Thibodeau's time, a kind of aura that surrounded him was that he overplayed his stars, like he played them too much.
Right.
And there may be something to that, but like Derrick Rose didn't really play more than, say, LeBron James or Kevin Durant, if you look at minutes per game.
Yeah,
but
I think it's the way he plays Jimmy Butler.
Jimmy Butler and Pau Gasol, how he plays those guys is absurd. There was actually a night a little while back, and I joked about this, which is Jimmy Butler, it was like on a back-to-back. Jimmy Butler got into 2 quick fouls. And Jimmy Butler, if you look at his foul rate, one of the things that makes him good is really, really low. So he gets into 2 quick fouls and gets seated. Same game, I think, Pau Gasol. I could be misremembering this, so apologies. Pau Gasol got like 40 minutes that same game. So it's like, oh, okay, you get into foul trouble. That's how, if you want to actually get rested on a Thibodeau team, if you're, Butler or Gasol, you got to get into foul trouble because he won't rest you when you're up.
And it's kind of ridiculous that he'll play Jimmy Butler 44 minutes when he shouldn't, but then when he gets 2 fouls and he should definitely leave him in, right to the bench he goes.
So yeah, that's I mean, the other question, I hate to say this, again, I'm going to apologize. Like this segment in the show notes, I'm probably going to have to call like we're horrible people because it's the same thing. I don't know if we can trust Pau Gasol to hold up with how he's been played. He's playing amazing.
I mean, the essential like reasons we took the under on them was Derrick Rose is not going to be a good player when he comes back. It's just he's been out of the league for 2 years, and players don't come back and be good players after that happens. Like you look back in the history, and it's basically never happened. It just doesn't happen. And B, Pau Gasol is like 34 years old, and the odds that he's going to return to superstardom and stay healthy are also low. So I don't trust it either. I mean, I think this team's in massive trouble anyway. They're looking at now a 4 seed maybe, even a 5 seed with Jimmy Butler being out. But I mean, without a healthy Pau Gasol and Jimmy Butler, I don't think they're going to be in the Eastern Conference Finals, and there's a question mark of whether they could even win in the first round.
Yeah, let's see. Actually, like this gets interesting. Some of the teams right around the border, I think, for instance, I think Milwaukee and Washington are a little stronger than they appear. And Miami is an interesting one because there's no way to come out of this just not being a horrible person. Chris Bosh, with the blood clots, it's a horrible thing, not a good thing to happen, but him opening up the door for more minutes to Whiteside makes that team better.
To be fair, I don't think Bosh at this point, like even a healthy Bosh, would block that. I think as good as Whiteside has been, by this point, he becomes the starting center and Bosh moves to power forward. And that's that, because anything else is just kind of foolish. So I think, rather than saying Whiteside's going to get more minutes because of Bosh, I think, it's like maybe Chris Anderson will get more minutes or Udonis Haslem will get some minutes.
That's rough. Haslem's
yeah. I mean, I don't think what I'm saying is I don't think the Bosh injury, it really has an effect one way or the other. Incidentally, I thought it was hilarious that Magic picked the Cavs to win the East. And the reason he said is because Derrick Rose and Bosh are out, so that paves the way. Which I think is hilarious because Derrick Rose was making the Bulls terrible. Like him being injured didn't really impact Chicago's chances. And B, the Heat have won 25 games. It's hilarious that he thinks Chris Bosh's injury, one way or another, plays any role on whether or not on who wins the Eastern Conference Finals. Because sure, I like the Dragic trade, but they're going to be a 7th seed at best. That team was not winning the Eastern Conference Finals no matter what happened. And Bosh is completely irrelevant to that. And also, great on Magic for, basically chiming in after Cleveland won like 16 out of 18 games. He chimes in and says, I think they're going to be Eastern Conference Finals champions. Like, where were you 10, 15 games ago when that would have been a bold statement?
By the way, I will say, and looking at that team, and this is nothing new to me as a Nuggets fan and Knicks fans are in the same boat, J.R. Smith is the Jason Terry of that team. So Jason Terry, who we discussed a little about, with the Mavericks and them winning the title. I forget if that was on the air before.
That was before the year.
Okay, so yeah, basically, so one of the things we discussed, one of the popular myths in analytics is playing JJ Barea as one of the reasons the Mavericks won the finals, and it was an analytics decision. And any analytics person who claims that was an analytics decision may as well claim that going to see a palm reader and get your sign read is,
because
let me get
JJ
this right, is
is
an astronomical decision. Okay, so, but Jason Terry actually shot the original Mavericks. He shot them out of their first finals. They should have won the finals. He had one of the worst games in a game-deciding game, shot them out. But then, as you were pointing out, in the next playoffs when they won it, he shot them into it. Maybe it was his magic. He got a tattoo of a finals trophy on his arm, saying it's magic.
Yeah. He was amazing in like games. I think it was like games 3 through the end of that series. Games 2, 3, 4, I think it was. He was amazing. And in the same game that, by the way, Barea was good for exactly one game. So I don't know why people are always talking about JJ Barea, but he was good for exactly one game. And I think Jason Terry in the same game went 6 of 10 from 3-point line or some ridiculousness. Jason Terry was like red hot in the exact same game. So I've never really, and then Jason Terry was very good in another couple of games in that series. So I've always wondered, like, why does JJ Barea get all the credit and Jason Terry gets none of the credit for that win?
Well, of course, the reason being is that your manager and your owner and your whatever to brag why they finally won doesn't just say, well, we picked up Jason Kidd and Tyson Chandler, who are very good players, and then some players got hot in the playoffs right when they needed to be. What he's going to say is, we made a brilliant analytical decision that we needed to make. And I mean, that's I don't know. I don't want to keep harping on that.
And
but,
I wonder how. I mean, Deshaun Stevenson must feel very bitter about that thing because that was pretty much the end of his career, right? It's like, oh, you're the guy who got subbed out for JJ Barea, and then their team won a championship, so you suck.
I got nothing else to say on that. And I was trying to be clever and look up Jason Terry's final splits while you were talking, but wasn't quite able to do that. Okay, so we're right about at the end. I'm trying to think, is there anything else we want to say about Derrick Rose? The comment I made about this, which seems kind of harsh, is I'm like, if you're someone who's optimistic about Derrick Rose returning and meaning anything, you're kind of in Greg Oden territory at this point. I'm sorry. Like, there's only so many injuries you can take.
Yeah, and the human body generally just doesn't come back to be the same after the kinds of injuries he's had. And I'm not saying that like some players come back to be productive after that, but they're not the same types of players. And if you look at the reasons Derrick Rose was good, it doesn't look well for him. He certainly doesn't appear to have made any kind of adjustment where he's a different type of player yet still productive after those injuries. He looks like he's trying kind of to be the same player, except that he's just very hesitant to attack the basket and do all the other things he used to be really great at. So, I mean, he was never a player who was like a great shooter and a great passer. He usually created good scoring opportunities by driving to the basket, right? And he now sort of stinks at that. So I don't see the road to Derrick Rose being anywhere near the kind of player he used to be. I just don't see it happening. And betting on that happening seems like it could happen, but it seems like a foolish bet.
And the rough part is there's nothing the Bulls can do. I mean, actually, the Bulls should actually be kind of happy that they're in a big market and have the bird rights to some good players, because that's really their only hope to stay competitive. And the good news is they've got those players. They've got Jimmy Butler. They've got Pau Gasol. They've got Joakim Noah. So, they maybe just need to get someone from the Spurs school of thought about how to keep your players healthy. All right, so
I think that the things that happened to Derrick Rose have been freakish injuries that they couldn't do anything about. But
yeah, and that's all I'm saying is for the remaining play. Like, I think the complaints about Derrick Rose being overplayed were probably off. I think the complaints about Jimmy Butler and Pau Gasol being overplayed are spot on based on what I'm seeing.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I don't really want to second guess Thibodeau too much in that respect, and I think there's some merit to saying, Jimmy Butler gets a say in this too, right? I mean, Jimmy Butler can go to his coach and say, "Hey, man, I can't take it," but I don't think he's doing that. So I feel like this is the kind of thing he gets a lot of blame for that maybe isn't necessarily his fault.
So actually something weird there. I'm going to completely this. Oh man, this is totally like a Fox News announcer. I'm just going to switch sides in the middle of my. I asked you a question on one side. In the middle of your answer, I'm going to hop the other. LaMarcus Aldridge, for instance, is a hilarious player where he'll just play through anything. And so like he had a day where he was on the injury list with like a wrecked thumb, and he was going to be out. And then he was like, "Yeah, I'll play." And so they're like,
Yeah,
"Okay,
no,
we'll let you play."
he basically did a Kobe and said, I have a dislocated thumb, but I'll just play through it. And I think it's a dislocated thumb, right? And he's just not going to get surgery for it, and he's going to play the rest of the season. I mean,
It's like and there's not. I mean, there is something to that where basketball players and professional athletes in general think that there's something weak about saying I should take a little time off for myself. It's I'm letting my team down, not hey, if I let my body heal, maybe I can play another 2 or 3 years.
yeah,
Which
which seems to be the opposite of the way Derrick Rose was approaching it, right? I mean, based on his interviews, he knew pretty well that if he rested enough, he could prolong his career. And I think at the end of the day, Derrick Rose will always get more opportunities just because of he's a former MVP. So somebody's always going to hope that the magic is going to return.
yeah, for as much as Sam Bowie or Bowie, however you say it, is called a draft bust, it's worth noting he decided when to end his career. There was an open offer from the Los Angeles Lakers for a contract, and he said, "Look, I'm just sick of playing. I'm sick of injuries. I'm sick of surgeries. I'm done."
Yeah.
So even Sam Bowie, who didn't ever make MVP, he was just the number 2 pick. He managed to last. Like I think Adam Morrison's the only case of like a top 5 pick I've ever seen get injured so bad that they didn't get like 3 chances. He got like 2 chances. He didn't get 3. So
I didn't know that Adam Morrison was injury related. I thought
yeah,
he was just
he got a
terrible.
pretty spectacular injury in his rookie contract, and that's one of the reasons he kind of faded quickly. Otherwise, he'd have stuck around, I bet.
Dre, if I can jump in for a second, I am showing the NBA leaders in minutes right now. Jimmy Butler is number 2 to James Harden, just 21 minutes behind him as of last night. And Pau Gasol is actually 21st as well. So both those guys are, in fact, playing a ton of minutes.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Nobody calls out Kevin McHale on this.
Huh.
Nobody seems to think McHale's a bad coach for having James Harden lead the league in minutes.
Well, I think that the Derrick Rose thing, and I did actually. It's funny. I wrote a post this week about Quora, so it's a site we've talked about. I actually wrote a piece that said I'm done writing about sports on Quora. There's just not enough engagement. I did at one point write an answer I think that said exactly what we're saying, which is I can't see anything wrong with how Derrick Rose was handled in terms of minutes, in terms of salary. It just seemed like he got injured at the wrong time and right after everybody wanted to point fingers.
Yeah, I mean, there's never a good time to be injured, right? This happened with Paul George, where everyone was like,
Why was he in
it's
the Olympics? Right.
yeah. Well, everyone was talking about how horrific it was that he got injured in a meaningless game, and I'm like, an injury like that, it's just always horrific, and it doesn't matter if I mean. He could have gotten injured on a practice. I mean, yes, there's like you want to talk about how stupid it was that the beam was that close to the basket and safety considerations. I'm all for that, but I hate the arguments who are saying he shouldn't be playing. Well, okay, so I guess it's only okay to get injured when it quote unquote matters. So does that mean I don't know, we shouldn't practice, we shouldn't have scrimmages, maybe let's not play the regular season, let's just not let anybody play a game at all until it becomes game 7 of the finals. And when does it matter? When is it okay?
Patrick, we need Allen Iverson to be our commissioner. He would set that straight.
I mean, I think that's foolish. I mean, it was a freak injury. It could have happened in practice. It could have happened in a scrimmage. It could have happened when he was playing 3-on-3 in a charity game. It doesn't matter. He could have happened in game 4 of the finals. It's horrible no matter when it happens. And I think it's absolute insanity to say, oh, well, he shouldn't be playing there because it doesn't matter. Because that's crazy. Because in order to play in the NBA, you have to practice at a certain level. Otherwise, you're going to be fat and out of shape and you won't be able to play. You have to give some kind of intensity in practice, in the preseason, in scrimmage, whatever. I think to say, oh, he shouldn't be playing is insanity. Now, I'm fine with taking the Spurs approach where he says, okay, it's the second night of a back-to-back on the road, and my team's played, 4 out of 5, so I'm going to rest Tim Duncan and Kawhi Leonard. That's totally different. You will notice that when Pop lets his guys play, he does not tell them to take it easy.
And by the way,
Tim Duncan never goes out there and relaxes when he's
look
playing,
at Tim Duncan's numbers, though, when he was younger, though. Like, they had absolutely no problem when Tim Duncan was in his prime saying, play away. It was the same as James Harden. You're in your prime. You're one of the best players in the league. play away, win us lots of
Yeah.
games, so we don't have to worry about our playoff seed.
And I'll concede that in the last 10 to 15 years, Pop might have, reevaluated his stance on this because of medicine or whatever. The point I'm trying to make, though, is when he gives players the green light to play, they play. They play hard and they go out to play, right? He doesn't tell Kawhi Leonard, hey, take some possessions off so that you're ready for the playoffs. He might give him a game off, but he's never going to put him in the position where he has to go out and sort of give a half-assed effort. He never wants that to happen. And I think that's a lot of what you kind of see with like the Clippers doing. Like when I watch Chris Paul, he looks a lot like a guy taking possessions off. And I'm like, if you're worried about being healthy for the playoff, take some games off, but give it your all when you're playing. It doesn't make any sense to go out there and half-ass it. And I feel the same way about the Paul George injury or any other kind of freakish injury that happens. It's like, don't say he shouldn't be playing because that's bullshit. You might as well just saying he shouldn't be an NBA player because in order to be an NBA player, in order to have the kind of body that you have as an NBA player and have the athleticism that you have as an NBA player, you are going to do a lot of things on your days off that are dangerous and then have injury risks. You can't just kind of lollygag it around all the time and then turn it on for games. In fact, if you did, then you'd be more likely to get injured. So
that's an interesting
players
point,
do every day in practice or whatever is inherently it carries the risk that people will get injured. And the Paul George thing was freakish. The Derrick Rose thing was freakish. Hell, the Chris Bosh thing is freakish. But you might as well tell him not to play basketball at all before you start with this bullshit about.
Well, notice the Chris Bosh thing,
playing.
the difference there, right? Since it's blood clots in the lungs, no one's saying, why was Chris Bosh on a basketball court? But because the injury happened on the basketball court, that's when the why were they X happens. So.
Right, but it could have happened in practice. Like
exactly, but that's all I'm saying is I think you're
foolish to play these stupid games about, well, why was he playing the fourth quarter? Why was he playing for Team USA? Why was he playing in a preseason game? Like, where do you draw the line? When does it matter and when does it not matter? These guys play basketball for a living. I don't think it's unreasonable to ask them to play basketball for Team USA. I don't think there's any like huge. I understand as Paul George's employer, you don't want him to do that because you don't want him to basically do anything unless it's for you. But that's obviously a totally different discussion. We're talking about ethics here and whether or not he should have been playing. And I say, hell yes, Paul George should have been playing there. But we can have a different discussion about whether the being behind the court should have been in that position. And I'll be all for you right there. If you tell me that's unsafe, I'll say, yeah, that's bullshit. But that's a totally different discussion.
And we will have that. Yeah, this is perfect. We're just coming down, gliding in for a soft landing to the end of the show. So that's a good end to end on it. Maybe we'll discuss that in a future date, the ethics of beam positions in games. I'm going to take us into shout outs. And actually, on the note of players playing a lot, something had happened. Anthony Mason passed away far too soon in his 40s. I'm going to have to write something about this at some point, which is these players that are greats, but they aren't perceived as greats because instead of getting 20 points or 10 rebounds, they get like 12 points and 9 rebounds and et cetera. But he was one of the reasons the Knicks came to prominence in the middle of the 90s. He helped out 3 different teams, was an amazing player, amazingly underrated. I think he's Hall of Fame caliber. And one of the quotes that we got was from, I think it's Papakar. Hope I'm saying that right in the comments. He is the only player since the 1980s, since 1980, to play 42 minutes a game for a season at star level. And that was in the season he was right behind Michael Jordan. So that's incredible. That's my shout out, Anthony Mason. I'm going to thank Papakar and Al S for their amazing comments that give more stats on Anthony Mason and also other great on the Knicks who doesn't get enough recognition. Charles Oakley, who was traded by the Bulls right before they took off. Luckily, he got traded back to the Bulls in the twilight of his career to get a ring. Anyway, those are my shout outs. I realized I forgot pre-show to ask any of you what your shout outs are, so I don't have them on the script. So I know this is me jumping without a net, but Patrick, do you have any shout outs to give this week?
I have kind of a private shout out, I guess. I'd like to shout out to the Seattle Animal Shelter for taking care of my new adopted dog, Whiskey, whom I brought home on Saturday. He's an awesome pup. And I think it's great work that the Seattle Animal Shelter is doing and all the shelters in Seattle and around here. Somebody told me that this area, I guess, is famous for it because dogs from places like Kentucky and Tennessee and all over the South, they get shipped to our shelters because we have these crazy high adoption rates and Seattle's such a dog-friendly area. So I'd like to give a shout out to basically the Seattle Humane Society and the Seattle Animal Shelter and all the shelters around here that do awesome work. rescuing dogs. And I'm happy to be. If you look at my Twitter feed, you can see a picture of Whiskey, really pretty dog. And I'm really happy that we have him in my family now, and that's my shout out.
Awesome. Anybody from you, Brian? I know you've been quiet on this show, which is more than fine. But do you have any shout outs? And if not, we can just take off.
I'm actually going to cheat a little bit on my shout out and just add a little to what Patrick was saying at the end of last segment, which is there may even be a benefit of players playing in international play. The big narrative around here locally in the Bay Area is that Klay Thompson's big leap from last year to this year was due to his Olympic experience, and playing with all those great players helped out his career. So just to throw that one last tidbit in there before we end the show.
Didn't work for Melo. Why couldn't it have worked for Melo? It was like only lasted there. I guess as soon as he left the Magic land and came home, it went away.
Well, that's because Melo shoots international threes at the NBA court, and they're not very good shots.
That is the perfect answer. All right, everybody. So just a reminder, you can find us at boxscoregeeks.com. You can find this show in the iTunes and Stitcher stores at the Boxscore Geeks Show. Follow Channel Nerd Numbers on YouTube if you want to get the live shows and also see the video shows with all sorts of great graphics that Brian puts up. Reminder once again, it is at NBA Geek on Twitter, at Nerd Numbers for myself, and at Boxscore Brian. Got anything you want to talk to us about? Hit us there at the site. And otherwise, we will see you next week.